Soy madre de 5 niñas. Vengo de Venezuela. Llegué a Cúcuta en búsqueda de mi hija. Lo que más me hace luchar cada día a día es mis niñas. La salud de ellas es lo más importante.
La situación en Venezuela está crítica. El alto costo del alimento, no hay empleo. Niños, ancianos y personas con enfermedades están muriendo por la falta de medicina. Tengo 8 días en el centro de atención. He recibido buenos tratos, todos los que estamos acá.
Gracias a Dios este centro me ha ayudado mucho, primero en centrarnos psicológicamente, tranquilidad mental. Al menos están este tipo de personas que nos prestan el apoyo, como lo hicieron alguna vez en Venezuela, nuestros hermanos colombianos también, acá nos reciben como hermanos.
Me vine por cuestiones de salud de un hijo que tengo con parálisis cerebral. Gracias a Dios aquí el medicamento no le ha faltado. En Venezuela no lo tenía. Yo llegué aquí, la atención que he recibido ha sido buena en cuestión de la alimentación y techo. Fue fuerte desprenderme de mi casa, de mis hijos, no estaba acostumbrada, pero yo sabía que lo hacía por un bien, por mí, y sí fue fuerte.
Es fuerte, pero nunca dejen de luchar por lo que quieren. Yo simplemente fui una soñadora que me vine con mi esposo y mi bebé, darle una buena estabilidad económica a mi hijo. Mi nombre es María Fernanda.
Mi nombre es Blanca Ortiz.
Mi nombre es Yadira Yankee.
Mi nombre es Marangeli Luz Meri Paredes.
Mi nombre es Edwin Argüello y me gustaría regresar nuevamente donde crecí, donde me crié, donde estuvo toda mi familia desde pequeño. Si en realidad pudiera yo regresar a mi país, en realidad no lo pensaría 2 veces.
Please welcome to the stage, John Thon Majuk.
Good afternoon. Okay, that's better. Good afternoon and welcome to our event on a path to self-sufficiency, advancing Venezuelan refugee integration in the Americas. Fitting to be hosted here in LA, the City of Angels. My name is John Thon Majuk, Director of the Refugee and Forced Displacement Initiative at the Wilson Center. RAFD aims to inform policymakers and practitioners by expanding the space for new perspectives, constructive dialogue, and sustainable solutions. Created by US Congress in 1968, the Wilson Center is the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for addressing global issues through independent research, open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for Congress, the executive branch, and the broader policy community. We live in an era of global unrest where the crises that cause human mobility and forced displacement continue to increase in complexity, severity, and magnitude, while global peace is in short supply. Of the more than 100 million displaced people, over 6 million are from Venezuela. How can we fully integrate our fellow displaced humans into our societies? What are the challenges and opportunities for integrating refugees and migrants. Today's event will tackle this question as we focus on the critical need for successful integration of Venezuelan refugees and migrants in Colombia, Ecuador, and the region. The speakers will address the crucial roles played by the public and private sectors in delivering solutions that are sustainable and efficient. The discussion will emphasize challenges and opportunities for refugee employment and entrepreneurship, both vital paths to self-sufficiency. I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to recognize the presence of the members of the diplomatic community, dignitaries from both Colombia and Ecuador, of course, our head of states, two heads of state, and members of the refugee and migrant community organization that are present here. I want to thank co-hosts, the Latin America program, the Wilson Center, the Conrad Hilton Foundation for sponsoring the event, and the Migration Policy Institute and the Pacific Council for their partnership. Housekeeping, the restrooms are outside on your right. The event is being recorded and it's live streamed. From the introductory remarks through the two panels with audience Q&A, two side charts with two heads of states, to the closing remarks, and everything in between, I'm sure you will enjoy the show. And now the show begins. Please welcome to the podium, Nora Presidio, Director of Immigrant Affairs from the City of Los Angeles, the City of Angels.
Shorter. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to all the sponsors today, Wilson Center, MPI, the Pacific Council, and the Conrad Hilton Foundation, both for the invitation and this important conversation. On behalf of the Mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our city of LA. I'm Nora Preciado, the Director of his Office of Immigrant Affairs. Los Angeles draws its strength from our very vibrant and diverse immigrant communities. And as such, we remain committed to ensuring that the city of Los Angeles is a welcoming city for everyone. Our city is home to 1.4 million immigrants, almost 36% of our population. Nearly 2 out of 3 Angelenos are either immigrants or the children of immigrants. They're the engine of our economy. They represent 43% of workers in our city and are half of our business owners. They play a critical role in very important industries like construction, manufacturing, transportation, and healthcare, just to name a few. And all those are really impressive statistics about our city, but behind each number are individual stories of sacrifice, hope, and dreams, very similar to those shared by many migrants crossing borders and oceans across the Western Hemisphere. Here under the mayor's leadership, it is my duty to ensure immigrants feel a sense of belonging and that they're able to reach their full potential. And it is also a very personal mission to me as a formerly undocumented immigrant from Mexico who understands on a very personal level the challenges of navigating your way in a new home. Our mission at the Office of Immigrant Affairs is to promote and advance the well-being, political, cultural, social of all our immigrants and refugees. We do this by developing programs and initiatives that ensure their full inclusion, providing information and resources, and we advocate for better immigration policies. But to succeed, we have to be strategic and collaborate at all different levels, international, national, local, and state. At the federal level, the mayor is a strong advocate for legislation that would provide a path to citizenship to all 11 million undocumented immigrants here in this country. And he also has supported expanding COVID-19 crucial relief to everyone, regardless of their immigration status in our country. But federal advocacy is not enough. As a local government, we play a tremendous role in integration. And we can't do it alone. And you all know that and are here to talk about that today. We partner very closely with government and non-government actors, with businesses, faith groups, and philanthropy to leverage resources and have greater impact to achieve inclusion. This translates into policies that reaffirm that LA, Los Angeles, is a welcoming city, and in very practical and immediate solutions as well to address problems like providing cash assistance during the pandemic, regardless of immigration status, to both individuals and businesses, or creating an immigration legal services program to prevent family separations due to deportation, just as 2 examples. Our vision is a more equitable Los Angeles where everyone, regardless of where they came from, what language they speak, who they love, who they pray to, or their immigration status, has the opportunity to thrive. Finally, Mayor Garcetti and the City of Los Angeles are proud and excited to be hosting the Summit of the Americas and all related events. We welcome all of you to our city with open arms, knowing full well that we share the same goal, ensuring the full inclusion of all migrants across the Western Hemisphere. I wish you a very productive conversation today, and we look forward to supporting you in your work. Thank you. And now it's my honor to invite to the podium the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, Luis Almagro.
I'd like to recognize and thank the Wilson Center and Ambassador Mark Green for putting the event together, which highlights the crucial importance of this topic. I also thank the Hilton Foundation, the Immigration Policy Institute, the Pacific Council, co-sponsor of this meeting. Special recognition to President Ivan Duque and President Guillermo Lasso. Thank you very much to everybody, dear friends, dear colleagues. At a time when the issue of migration is at the very top of our hemispheric agenda, the case of Venezuela becomes more important than ever to refocus our debate on the case itself and to draw lessons for other diasporas in the Americas. 6.2 million people have migrated since the beginning of Venezuelan economic crisis in 2014, making it the largest refugee crisis in Latin American history and the 3rd largest in the world, after Syria with 6.8 million and more than a decade of civil war, and Ukraine with 7 million already after 3 months of a brutal war of aggression. The math speaks of itself. Consider that the number of Venezuelan refugees was 2 million in September 2018, when we created the working group on Venezuelan migrant and refugee flows, and I appointed David Smolansky as a commissioner of the OAS Secretary General for the crisis of Venezuelan migrants and refugees. We did so on consideration that the Inter-American Program for the Promotion and Protection of the Human Rights of Migrants, including migrant workers and their families, instructs the organization to carry out specific activities for the protection of the human rights, and that the region has in place legal instruments for the protection of refugees, such as the 1984 Cartagena Declaration on Refugees, among others, and those contained in the global agreements on migrants and refugees, which establish as a priority of the states the protection of the rights of these populations, as well as shared global responsibility. And this is why we are here. We know that this is a shared global responsibility. No war, no natural disaster, and yet 6.2 million people are out of Venezuela today. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, 1.2 million Venezuelans have left. The size of the exodus outnumbers the population of Panama, Costa Rica, Norway, or Ireland, to name a few. Thus, we talk about a country outside a country, and yet it has been the most underfunded refugee crisis in the world. Since 2014, per capita donations to the Venezuelan refugee crisis represent 10% of the Syrian crisis, and preliminary figures estimate an even lower percentage compared with the Ukrainian crisis. As our working group has shown, Venezuelans migrate due to mutually reinforcing factors: a complex humanitarian crisis that includes disease and malnutrition, generalized and systematic violations of human rights, widespread criminality, a collapse of public services, and the deepest economic contraction in the world. Of course, this cannot be understood divorced from the particular character of autocratic rule in the country. That is a criminal state that has dismantled democratic institutions and abdicated from its main obligations, contracting them out to irregulars. In Venezuela, there is no monopoly of the means of coercion. There is no territorial and border control, revenue collection, nor the definition and enforcement of property rights. As a result, the rule of law has disappeared, and criminal organizations, regional and extra-regional ones, have become the locus of political power. In other words, they are competing sovereigns, people free for their lives, food, health, security. Given the urgent humanitarian nature of the crisis, it's necessary to deploy resources to aid the host countries and mobilize resources to address the needs of Venezuelans, migrants, and refugees. Forced migration is a humanitarian as much as a development challenge, but it is also an opportunity. I want to highlight two recent approaches and two development experiences in Colombia and Ecuador. 2021, the Colombian government provided a 10-year temporary protected status to most of the 1.8 million Venezuelan migrants in the country, thereby creating an environment conducive to their integration. Barely a year later, launching that truly revolutionary initiative, Colombia has just registered 1 million migrants. President Iván Duque has produced a progressive agenda for refugee absorption and integration with almost no parallel in the world. Recognizing that the regularization is key, including access to the jobs market, Ecuador also plans to introduce an initiative that would put the more than 500,000 Venezuelans its host on the path towards socioeconomic inclusion. President Guillermo Lasso has proposed legislation to tackle a problem that requires the collective efforts of government, development, humanitarians, and private sector partners. Here is an important lesson. For this reason, I would like to conclude with a call to all nations in the Inter-American system to look at these programs, learn from them, and if possible, replicate them so as to share the cost of integration among all of us and fulfill the promise of a hemisphere with human rights and democratic institutions for all. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Silvia Aspendola, Marcela Escobari, Dr. Eduardo Stein, Julieta Valls-Noyes, and Benjamin Gadon.
Excellent. Many thanks again for everyone participating in this conversation today. As we try to do regularly at the Wilson Center, we're going to guide this conversation in the direction of policies that have worked, that could be replicated, that have or could obtain the right resources to address what is a monumental problem. I think the Secretary General was quite helpful in underlining the scale of this problem, really unprecedented in the region, but also globally as well in terms of the resources that have so far been brought to bear. We are focusing, as you can tell, on two case studies here, those of Colombia and Ecuador, not only because of the size of the challenge that those governments have faced, but more so because of the creativity and ambition that we have seen in the response of those governments to this issue. Decisions that are costly in terms of resources and also courageous in terms of public opinion and the politics of refugee and migrant integration, which we've seen play out in ways that are unhelpful to the integration of migrants and refugees in other parts of the world. And so I think our effort here today and in our conversation and the one that you'll be involved in when we have our question and answer period is to understand what has worked and not worked in these integration models. What is the role of the international community in the United States in supporting the practices that have been effective? And again, what could other countries that are facing similar challenges do? I should have introduced myself in more detail. I'm Benjamin Gadan. I'm the acting director of our Latin American program at the Wilson Center. I'm going to introduce our distinguished government representatives as I ask them their first round of questions. And I am going to start over the far end there with Lucas Gomez, an advisor to the president of Colombia on Venezuela-Colombia border issues. Lucas, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Benjamin.
My question for you relates, as I just hinted, to the Colombian approach to this issue. Luis Almagro, the Secretary General of the OAS, remarked upon the scale and ambition of the integration approach in Colombia. Correctly, justifiably, it received a lot of very positive reaction internationally, given the scale of the challenge, the over 1 million Venezuelan migrants that Colombia had agreed to regularize and integrate. I believe it's now been long enough since that was announced for us to do a little bit of analysis of how it has worked. What have you learned from this experience? What resources have or should have been made available from the international community? And what from that experience we might export to other countries facing a similar challenge? So welcome, Lucas.
No, thank you very much. And thank you to Wilson Center and MPI, Pacific Council and Hilton Foundation to organize this main event. And I think it's for the Colombian government, it's a really good opportunity to share what we are doing. And something that we are learning at this moment with this TPS, with this temporary protected status is that we are betting on the future of the country. We are betting in this idea that the only way that we have in Colombia and I think that in the host countries is the social economic integration. The numbers are very, very high. Today we have more than 2.3 million of Venezuelans, brother and sister Venezuelans, migrants who complete the first step of our regularization process with the pre-registration. And that's very important because we are making visible the migrants. And I think that is the first step. But when we talk about regularization, we are talking about the first step for the that we call the master key for social and economic integration, for access to social programs. And when we start to with the President Duque, and I think that Secretary General Almagro say very clearly, President Duque, his leadership take this decision, and we start to think that in the middle and long-term integration of migrants. And the idea with making them visible, I think is not only in the way to have this position of change the chip. I said yesterday in a dinner. We have to change the chip. That the first step was the migratory choke that we have in Colombia, but then with this humanitarian approach and with the help of the United Nations and the Eduardo leadership also, we facing the migration at the beginning. But the most important here, and that's very important to have also Marcela and Julieta with us, because the government of the United States in the cooperation issues, we feel that we are not alone, with this idea that we face at the beginning a humanitarian crisis, but now is time to go and move in the social and economic integration. So that's why I think that just to send a message, and maybe the most important message that we are learning in this moment, but we want to share with other countries, is Don't be afraid to regularization process. Don't be afraid of that. But it's not the end, the regularization process. It's the beginning of something more important, that is the social and economic integration.
Lucas, many thanks. Let's now turn to Ecuador, a country that has not been afraid to take steps that, again, are truly courageous from a domestic political perspective, and compared to a lot of the ways other regions have addressed questions like this. We're happy to have Silvia Espondola, the Vice Foreign Minister for Human Mobility in Ecuador, precisely to talk about labor market integration and some of the policies that Ecuador is now implementing and will be soon rolling out to address more than 500,000 Venezuelan refugees and migrants who have moved to Ecuador in recent years. Sylvia, welcome.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank for your invitation to participate in this forum to talk about this important issue, to share experiences. I would like to thank the Wilson Center, the MPI, the Hilton Foundation, and the Pacific Council. Ecuador is one of the 3 main recipient countries of Venezuelan migration in the region. International organizations estimate that around 500,000 of Venezuelan citizens are living in Ecuador, plus another 250,000 who are in transit. This represents around 3% of the national population. Despite the economic and budgetary difficulties that Ecuador has faced in recent years, my country has decided to implement effective actions to take care of the Venezuelan and immigrant citizens in my country and to work for their integration. For instance, facing the COVID-19 pandemic, Ecuador's vaccination plan has benefited more than 1 million foreign citizens, of which around 250,000 are Venezuelan nationals. According to the World Bank, healthcare services, education, and other social services represent around $80 million of the national budget. We believe that regularization is a central and elemental issue to the social and economical inclusion in our society. That is why last week, President Guillermo Lasso signed a presidential decree establishing a regularization process, which allow a regular stay for Venezuelan citizens and also other foreign nationalities. This process includes social and economical integration for migrant citizens that will be implemented with the support of international community. The new regularization process will be preceded by the registration process that will be very helpful to count with information to implement public policies, specific public policies, and effective to migrant population. Furthermore, we believe the local integration cannot be achieved without bringing together fostering communities and migrant population. Under this premise, the government of Ecuador is working very hard to prevent all forms of discrimination, promoting respect and inclusion of foreign population living in Ecuador. These actions are carried out within the framework of the fulfillment of the rights of migrant citizens and also based on the recognition of the benefits that an orderly, safe, and regular migration can offer the host countries and communities. Regularized migrants contribute to the economic growth of countries of destination and origin. According to the World Bank, the inclusion of Venezuelan migrants, citizens in Ecuador, could have a positive impact between 1.6 and 1.9% on the national GDP. We are confident that the new regularization process will contribute to the economical and social inclusion. Thank you.
Many thanks. I'm going to turn now to Eduardo Stein. He's the Joint Special Representative for Venezuelan Refugees and Migrants for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and the International Organization for Migration. Eduardo, welcome and thank you for being here. Let me ask you about the resources available within these countries to assist these communities and to reflect a little bit on why it's such an underfunded refugee crisis from the perspective of the international community. I think Sylvia very rightly points out that in the medium and long term, these communities represent enormous economic opportunities for the countries that they're settling in. But in the short term, they represent extraordinary costs at a time of great resource scarcity throughout Latin America, one of the hardest hit regions by the public health and economic impacts of the pandemic. My question for you is to help us understand more about the international response to this and what resources are needed so that these very positive models can succeed.
I'm just going to take 45 minutes. 4 to 5
4
minutes.
to 5, there you go.
Well, I think that the efforts shown by the different receiving countries and their governments are the best example of how to transform a crisis of such a magnitude that Latin America had never, ever experienced into precisely a strategic vision of multiple opportunities. Governments were particularly generous in their populations in receiving the first different flows of Venezuelan women, men, children. And yet the resources became almost immediately scarce because the region was not prepared for such a human catastrophe. So, as was already mentioned, the first order of business was to attend the humanitarian emergency needs, mostly at the crossings. But gradually, governments themselves realized that they were able to get together without the constraints of a formal legal structure internationally negotiated and signed, but just as an ad hoc experiment in the Quito process. And from our end, the UNHCR and IOM were able to call for non-governmental organizations as well as UN agencies and other regional organizations to form this platform of coordination for getting as quickly as we could to localities where the people were being received and began to take concrete form experiences of integration. Not only economic integration, but human integration in those communities. Now, we are, of course, talking about something that happened amidst transformations throughout the world, political transformations, and challenges that are questioning democracy itself in many regions. Secondly, no one could preview, the COVID-19 pandemic. So a lot of the population that in many countries depended on informal economic activities were out of business and were almost automatically in a situación de calle. So governments had to find ways of attracting international cooperation to join their efforts and monetary investments in the solution. And this is perhaps one of the best examples that we have found in Latin America. One, the creation of an ad hoc understanding platform, the Quito process, in which governments have been able to exchange positive and constructive experiences, and also the coordinating platform in general. I exceeded the 5 minutes, sorry.
Many thanks, Eduardo. Marcela Escobar, you are the Assistant Administrator of USAID's Latin America and Caribbean Bureau. It is your responsibility, among many others, to address and shape the U.S. approach to migration in the Americas. I just broadly want to hear your views on what the United States should be doing to manage migration at this time.
Thank you, Ben. I think it's important to put into context the scale of the migration challenge that Eduardo and our colleagues just described, because so much of the attention in the US is focused on our border, which is understandably so. But when we think about displacement across Latin America, it has risen 17 times faster than the displacement from Latin America to the US over the past decade, right? So how the region responds now to this massive challenge will determine not only the fate of these 7 million people that we've been discussing, but also whether migration fans the flames of the current economic contraction or whether it becomes an engine for growth. And I do think that we have a very short window of opportunity to take a really bold response and in what I called turning this into sustainable migration. And I think that strategy requires us to focus on 3 things at the same time. One is the root causes, right? Which is the root causes that are driving people to leave their homes. And as Secretary Blinken likes to say, protect their right to stay in their homes. And this is our day job at USAID. But second is we must expand lawful legal pathways to enable those that do migrate to do so in conditions of safety, dignity, and the greatest mutual benefit, and to apply to those visas and legal pathways from within their countries. And third, and most importantly, is what we're discussing in this conversation today, is for us to support our partner nations around the region to integrate migrants into host communities, allowing them to work and live in the countries where they arrive. I think the socioeconomic integration of migrants, I think it's really a central view, right? And these 3 elements in action, because it really has a commons element to it, which is that if all countries coordinate and burden share, we really can turn this tragedy into an economic boom. But if not, it will become politically untenable for the few bold countries that decide to do this. So I think we are in this together. The US has invested over $2 billion in this emergency in the last 5 years, and we want to continue to support these countries and really turn this human tragedy into a source of opportunity for the region.
Many thanks, Marcela. Our last expert government panelist for this discussion comes to us from the United States Department of State, Julieta Noyes, Assistant Secretary of the PRM Bureau, the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. A question I have for you relates to the perceived, and I think correctly perceived, permanence of a lot of these communities, and how that's a different challenge than other challenges the Bureau faces in other parts of the world. How important is the recognition that these communities are likely to be in these countries in a protracted way? And what should that mean for the way that we address it, the resources we provide, the importance of precisely this kinds of conversations, which are about integration?
And thank you very much. And I also want to thank the hosts, the organizers, and the fellow panelists today. This topic today is a little personal for me. I have to say, I am the daughter of refugees, and I lived in Venezuela when I was younger, when my dad was working there. So this one hits close to home. I would, Benjamin, sadly, just a couple of weeks ago, we reached a really tragic milestone in the world when the UN High Commissioner for Refugees announced that the world now has over 100 million forcibly displaced people. And that number has never been reached in history. And sadly, this is a problem that affects all regions. And equally sadly, the majority of people who are so forcibly displaced when they leave their countries tend not to return home quickly. That's what we're seeing in Venezuela, but it's what we're seeing in crises in Syria, Rohingya who've left Burma. I mean, this is a pattern that exists around the world. And so it's really critical that as we, as donors and, you know, the generous American taxpayer who have contributed $2 billion to this crisis in Venezuela, and the major countries that are contributing to support Venezuelans who have left their homes, Colombia and Ecuador, of course, but there are 17 countries in this hemisphere that have accepted Venezuelan refugees. And so it's really important that we work together, the donor countries, the host countries, the international organizations, the NGO sector, really need to work together to address, we see sort of 4 main areas of approach that are needed to respond to crises like this, whether it's in Venezuela or whether we're talking about Ukrainians in Poland or wherever it may be. And the first is, of course, the emergency support. People need food, they need clean water, they need shelter, they need sanitation and health services to save their lives. And that's always the first aspect in a crisis. The second aspect is looking at the need for protection. Some of these populations are people who are particularly vulnerable, whether you're talking about unaccompanied children or LGBTQI plus people, women who've been raped. These are people who need special protection, special services, psychosocial support, legal advice, legal assistance. So that aspect is really critical in a crisis like this. The third aspect, I would say, is capacity building. Helping these countries that are so generously hosting, these communities that are so generously hosting refugee groups, providing them technical support, technical assistance to improve their own systems, to improve whether it's their education, their health services, housing, but also training, that capacity building to help them at a time of crisis for themselves. And then the fourth piece is the one that I think this panel is most focused on, and that is the long-term integration piece. How do you create the conditions in host communities to make that integration long-lasting, sustainable, and positive? So you can, you know, sometimes you have to provide some training to counter xenophobia. Sometimes you provide training for the refugees themselves, entrepreneurship training. You can provide seed money for the creation of small businesses, but you also provide support for the host communities so that they don't see all the resources going to the refugees while the people from the host community are being left behind as part of the effort. So it's a really complicated effort. It involves the generosity of the host countries. It involves the donor nations, the international organizations, the NGOs working across all of these sectors, usually doing all of these things at the same time. But I just want to say that, again, we are so grateful to the American taxpayer, to the generous nations that have provided all of this support to Venezuelans and to nations that are doing the same all around the world. Thank you.
Lucas. The Assistant Secretary mentions the need to combat xenophobia, to make sure that host communities feel that they're also gaining resources and support. I want to talk to you, if we could, just a bit about that question, about the domestic politics, the issue of public opinion, the challenge of making sure that Colombians understand the importance of doing this, the long-term benefits. I think there had been this assumption at the very beginning, and Eduardo mentioned the early support throughout Latin America for this extraordinary flow of refugees and migrants. Unfortunately, in not all places has that been sustained. And we've seen some policies that have been less favorable and less useful for the long-term integration. Can you talk a bit about how your government has made sure that Colombians recognize this responsibility, but also this opportunity?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much. And just to say that as we say before, we are in a challenging times. You know, is very challenging. For example, in Colombia, we receive in 5 years 2 million of migrants. That's very high. But as I say in the first intervention, of course, we are moving in the direction of social economic integration. But let me just say something that Eduardo mentioned that I think is very powerful, is integrate humanity, be empathic. The xenophobia is something that we have to combat and we have to try to dissolve. But the most important here is how we're going to do that. And I think that the response that we are making and we are working and building in Colombia is this notion of integration. And for example, we launched 2 weeks ago the integration centers, Integrate. And the Integrate has this idea to provide services to migrants with the support of USAID. And the idea to give to the migrants in some kind of one-stop shop all the opportunities. But the message, and the most important message, is not only for migrants, it's also for host communities. Because when we start to work in the dimension of integrate migrants, I get back with the integrate humanity. And the humanity is not only for the foreign people, they are also for the Colombians. And the message that the president every time send to us and say to us is that we are not going to create a special program for migrants. We're going to give them the same opportunities that Colombia has. And that's very important. We just, the president signed 3-4 days ago, a presidential document to all the institutions in the national government to say that the Venezuelan has the same rights that Colombian has. That's very powerful. And the message that we are sending is not only for Venezuelans, it's also for Colombians to say they are your brothers and sisters and they're going to receive the same treatment that you have. That's very important. And of course, something that for us is something that we worry about a lot, but I say we are in challenging times, but it's not only because our government is going to finish in less than 60 days. It's because we are dealing with something that in the theory, in the political science theory, is a policy state, not only a governmental policy. This is a state policy that's going to remain for 10 years. And that's the message that we are sending. No matter what happened the 7th of August, the migrants are going to stay in Colombia, they're going to remain in Colombia, and we have to deal with the migration in this notion of social and economic integration and integrate humanity. And finally, something that we are doing also, and I think there's a strong message, and Julieta mentioned also, this is a work team. We have to work together. The notion of state policy is also linked with this idea. It's not only at the responsibility of the government, of the local government or the national government. We need also civil society. We need also the private sector, and we need also the academia sending a message and sending the message of integration, of no xenophobia, of not discrimination, because we are in a country that needs, today we understand, and I think this is the most important in these past 2 years, that we understand that the migrants are going to remain in Colombia. No matter what happened in the other side of the border, they're going to remain in Colombia. They are building their lives. They are working for have a better future for them and their families. So we have the responsibility to give them, to provide them all the opportunities as the same if they be Colombian. So we are working on that. It's very, very challenging, but we are doing with the conviction that we can do.
So we just have about 3 minutes left, but I want everyone to have one last chance to contribute. And the question I'll ask is just, look, it's been an under-resourced crisis since before the pandemic and since before the invasion of Ukraine created yet another even larger scale refugee crisis. What more should the international community be doing to help? Let that be the last question for each one of you. We'll start with you, Marcela, and then we'll go across.
Right. No, I just wanted to add quickly to this point.
Please do. No.
That this, fighting xenophobia just doesn't happen naturally. It really requires leadership. It is very easy to weaponize migration. And I remember hearing about the Confama campaign around Venezolano rima con hermano. And similarly, when I'm being in Costa Rica and talking to a taxi driver, which is usually where I get my public policy advice, and I said, hey, what do you think about these Nicaraguans? There's so many coming over the border. I was just like fanning it. And he was like, they're hardworking people. They're just like us. We help them, they'll help us. I was floored. And I do think these countries need, recognition for that work. Look, I think countries are leading the way. Our colleagues who we have in this table, and many more, and we've got to be behind them. I think this policy that Colombia has done of granting TPS for 2 million Venezuelans, I think it will go in the history books as one of the most magnanimous policies in history. And I think for us, we want to help work hand in hand with our partner countries to create that blueprint of effective integration so that other countries that do this and take this bold decision will have that blueprint. And for us, it has meant helping with registration, surge staff during the inflow, teaching journalists to fight anti-immigration narratives, et cetera, et cetera. And most important, the challenge now is going to be the integration into labor markets, right? We know that through research of Danny here, that immigrants who are integrated, start businesses 10 times as much. We know when we worked in Peru that when you help, those who have credentials integrate them and validate them, they can put their skills to work. And I think we want to be part of that story so that this human tragedy becomes an opportunity.
Let's be very, very brief. We do have President Iván Duque from Colombia waiting to participate and share his direct insights, but please go right ahead with your closing remark.
So I wanted to say that we have to continue. You asked what more we can do. We have to continue to do what we've been doing. We have to get creative and look for new solutions like the World Bank's new global concessional financing facility for countries that are hosting migrants. But let's not overlook the role that the migrants themselves, as Marcela was just saying, in being self-reliant and providing for themselves. Thank you.
Wonderful. Sylvia.
Thank you. I would like to say that we are working closely with IMO and also with ACNUR. They are very good partners, and we need the cooperation of all our partners, the international community, to face this challenge that we have to regularize the Venezuelan citizens in our country. We are committed with regular, orderly, and especially safe migration. And I think that this is a good way to fight effectively against human trafficking. Thank you.
Eduardo, 30 seconds.
I like the expression of how easy it is to weaponize forced migration. And that has been happening throughout our hemisphere, not only in Latin America, by the way. There have been people that have used the conflicts created by newcomers into communities that are in need of developing resources and try to convert those clashes into accusations to serving governments, rather than what most governments have been promoting, and that is a sense of co-responsibility, not only intergovernmental responsibility, but also societal co-responsibility. Thank you very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our panelists for their insights and all the work they've done to support migrants and refugees in the world.